You just press play on the Last Breath Hunt Cast, home of the Huntroversy. We're here to entertain, educate, and engage. And in case you didn't know, you only live once. But if you do it right, once is enough. Don't waste it.
Three, two, one, here we go. This is the Last Breath Hunt Cast. My name is Garrett, and today we are talking about a buck that I killed several weeks ago called Hershey's. Now, before we get into this very much, 2 days ago, I lost my voice completely. Don't know why, don't know how. So if I'm a little raspy today, that's why. Bear with me. We're going to get through this. It's a really cool story about this deer. He was actually the number one deer on this particular farm that I wanted to kill. And if you haven't seen the pictures of him, here's a little tidbit. He's a one-eyed warrior, old deer, and he's had a turd of a rack from the beginning. So this isn't one of those stories about a giant, massive 7.5-year-old, 200-inch deer, but it is a story about my number one due to the fact that he eluded us for so long and because he's just a one-of-a-kind deer. I will never, ever kill a buck that looks like him. Also, later on in the podcast, I'm going to share with you some Christmas gift ideas as Old St. Nick's arrival is just a couple short weeks away. And then lastly, I got a couple other things and announcements to share with you. But before we do that, before we kick off episode 169, I got to pay the bills. And if you've listened to this podcast very long, or if you're a new listener, you're going to find out that this podcast is proudly presented to you by Badlands Gear. Absolutely love their gear. We've been working with that company for a long time. Blake and the team over there have really embraced the whitetail world. Now, they still make some amazing Western gear. They're continually putting new stuff out. In fact, they just came out with a new pant that I wore on my father-in-law's elk hunt, and they were awesome. But for most of our listeners, and most everybody is a whitetail hunter, they've really gravitated towards that niche of people. And so they launched the new Celine's pant and jacket, which really kind of bridged the gap between the Rise and the Pyre suit, giving you a true mid-season, that November kind of hunting garment. And with the code LASTBREATH22BL30, you'll receive 30% off at the checkout. So again, if you're thinking about a Christmas gift, well, there you go. Save you some coin. This podcast is also brought to you by Tompkins Taxidermy. Wayne and Michael have become friends of ours. They do amazing work. Their turnaround time is fantastic. They're priced very competitively. And more than anything, their communication really separates them from other people. Now, don't get me wrong. There are taxidermists that do fantastic work nationwide and even in our little pocket in the Midwest. But Wayne and Michael don't sacrifice any of those pillars that makes a great taxidermist to be able to get you what you need. So like I said, blue ribbon work, very quick turnaround in terms of normal turnaround time. They're priced very competitively with the market. And lastly, they'll communicate with you and they'll work with you no matter what your circumstance is. If you want to know more about them, the last podcast that we recorded, 168, they do some more explaining, and we've recorded ones with them in the past, but great people. We're lucky to get to know them and work with them. Outdoor Edge, Knives and Gear, another great sponsor of ours. They have really just been one of those companies in the outdoor market that's weathered all storms in a highly saturated market. And Dave and the guys and gals that work there, they just do a great job. They put out quality knives, and whether it's a grilling kit or whether it's just an EDC knife, you got your bases covered. And lastly is Moultrie Mobile. Their new Edge cameras have been working really well for me and for Grant. I know Cody over at Whitetail Legacy has been running several of them, and they've just finally worked out all the kinks that they had with the original Delta. These new Edge cameras really have done everything they promised they were going to do, and so far it's been absolutely great results for me and the people that I know running them. Now, let's get into the story of Hershey's. And to talk about the story of Hershey's, really I need to own up about a deer that I had an encounter with in November. So I took my rutcation, as I told you guys I was going to, kind of bridged that. Actually, I didn't even bridge it. I took that whole week off, given the fact of where those days landed in November. And so it was on the 11th of November, it was that Friday. I went in for a morning hunt in a place that we call the Trench. It's just a great funnel on a property that really picks up in November. And so there was about 3 deer on this farm that I was interested in. Hershey's was number 1. Old, stinking, just the king of the farm. There was a deer called Chachi, who is the highest scoring deer on the farm. And then there was a deer called the Ziegler. And the Ziegler was a newer deer. And we usually recruit a newer 3.5 to 4.5 caliber age deer every year from the surrounding area. And this deer, I believe to be 4.5. Really nice, clean, snow white rack 10. And kind of his sign of who he was is he was very boxy. I would say he's probably 19 inches wide-ish. And his main beams came out, rectangled perfectly in, and then instead of his tips of his beams kind of haloing in, they went straight up. So he had this really cool look, and all of his tines kind of had that same notion where when they came off the main beam, they just went and turned straight up. I would guess him to be, that nice 150-inch caliber type deer. Had good brow tines, but nothing special. His 2s were longer than his 3s, longer than his 4s. He was the epitome of like your typical 10-point. And so that deer was a deer that I'm like, all right, I need to really see him on the hoof. I try to do my best to harvest that 5.5, an older caliber deer, but given the season, given the opportunities, and the lack of deer on really my roster, I was like, okay, if I see this deer, I'm going to figure out if I want to kill him or not. So if you remember the inner circle, you heard the story of what happened with the Ziegler. And if you're not, I'll let you know what happened now. So it's Friday morning. It was cold, and I had the thermals working in my favor, and the wind was actually perfect for this set. So I'm sitting there, and I saw the Ziegler, it was the first deer that I saw that morning, work the opposite ridge away from me. So he is walking. I'm facing down the draw, and he is walking towards me on the opposite side. The trench is a big funnel. It's a large cut. That's timber. It's roughly maybe 120 yards wide at the widest point. And I'm hunting the corridor where the deer travel up and down the creek when bucks are checking the bedding areas or bouncing from property to property. So he is walking towards me, but he's high on the other side of the ridge where I'm down in the bottom. He doesn't know I'm there, and I let him get even with me and then a little bit past me just to make sure my wind was bulletproof if he tried to come in and backdoor me. I gave him a grunt. He stopped, picked his head up, and then kind of put his head back down, was getting ready to leave. I gave him one snort wheeze, real aggressive, and boom, that was all it took. He whirled around, and he started marching right towards me. So I'm self-filming. I've got the camera in front of me. I'm in a split cherry tree, and it works out really well when you're trying to self-film because for a right-handed shooter, I prefer to set my stands up so I can shoot seated. Way less movement, and I feel a little more stable when I shoot my bow seated than when standing. So if I didn't have this split, I would have to have the camera arm on my left side. So I would have to hold my bow with the right hand, adjust the camera arm with my left arm, then put the bow in my hand, and it's a little bit extra movement. So this is, like I said, the perfect kind of tree to self-film. So the camera is in front of me directly. I've got my bow in my hand, and he's on a string, and it happens quick. I mean, you guys that deer hunt know that when you've got an aggressive buck that's coming in, they don't take their time. The godsend was that he hit a scrape at about 45 yards from me, and I was able to move the camera into the shooting lane that I believed he was going to walk in, which he ended up doing. And the biggest issue is that we use fluid heads. And if you don't have those tensionometers, there's like two different points that you can tighten or loosen for the traction, I guess, that it gives on the head for its vertical movement and its horizontal movement. So I did not have the up and down knob tightened all the way. I thought it was tight enough, so I swung it over into my lane and I let go of the camera. And that camera sagged to find its balance point, and unfortunately it sagged down. So I, hit record, he's coming in, I'm like, boom, forget about the camera, right? He's pointed right in the window that I thought he was going to come in. It was too good to be true. One of those scenarios where I'm hyper confident because I'm like, all right, there's no way he can smell me. He hasn't seen me. And he's going to march right into my like 25, 26 yard window that I have cut for this scenario. He's walking in. He's about 15 feet from the hole. I draw back. And then I made the biggest mistake of this season. And I look back at the camera and I notice that the tops of his antlers are just at the top of the frame. And I begin to like do the freak out, like, oh crap, he's going to be out of frame. So I'm fully drawn. He is steps away from being in my window. I reach out with my draw hand to try to bump the camera and push it up, right, to center him in the viewfinder. And when I did that, I was fine until I opened up my fingers from my release. And I think, between the added grip strength and the loss of like mind to muscle connection, the bow jumps. And so I am extended away from my face about a foot. The bow jumps. It doesn't go off. The arrow doesn't go out of the string. But I smack the camera with my release hand. It makes a lot of noise. And of course, now the camera's pointed completely in the wrong direction. And I'm at half draw. I catch it and I look, and there is the Ziegler halfway, not even, maybe a third into my lane. And there is a big locust tree that is right on the edge, the far left side of my shooting lane. He's walking from my left to right, and he's looking right at me, right? I redraw back, and the best way I can explain it is that if you have a shoulder mount, and just a regular semi-sneak shoulder mount, and you look at the point of where the paint meets the fur on the back, that is what I had. And this locust tree is covering up the majority of his shoulder and the traditional kill zone. So I lean forward as much as I can, and I'm like, I have a shot, right? I'm either going to smoke this locust tree or I'm going to tuck it right into the shoulder. And given my setup, I was like, I shouldn't have any issues. And I took the shot, and it hit exactly where I told the pin to go. Not that this makes it any better, right? But I hit him dead center of body, right on the point of that shoulder. And I even for a split second thought, should I aim at the front of his shoulder to not have to worry about the scapula and that shoulder bone? But I'm like, he's not really quartering to me hardly at all. He's almost perfectly broadside, but he's turned and facing me. Touch it off, and I was actually jacked up because I thought I'd pulled off this crazy Hail Mary shot. It wasn't far, but it was just high percentage of any error, especially to the left, and you're going to have an issue. So he runs about 70 yards away, and he gets back up on the hill in the timber, and he stands there for like maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes. And I can see the cut on him. I can see the two blade opened up vertically, which was great. And I'm like, man, that looks like a really good shot. And he's turning around, he's licking it. So I'm analyzing him. I got my binoculars out. And if there was any way that I could have gotten another shot off, without a doubt, I would have flung another arrow. But there's just no way, as he's up the hill, and it's a very locust hedgy timber. So I can see him, but there's no chance I could get an arrow through all that. And I can watch blood dripping, and I can see that he's licking it, and so his mouth is even red. And I was like, oh, I kind of got a little excited thinking maybe that was lung blood coming from his mouth. But it was concerning that he didn't fall. I'm like, 90 seconds. I'm thinking to myself, fall over any second, right? He flicks his tail, and he just walks really slowly away from me. So automatically I'm going, all right, it wasn't that 10-ring shot. You did not make that happen. I back out completely. I didn't even go look for my arrow. Didn't go look for blood. I completely backed out. And I gave the deer about 5 hours. And I went back out in the early afternoon. Picking up the blood trail at first was great. Where he had stood up top of the hill where I saw him, there was probably a platter-sized area of blood. And the first 150 yards of blood was very easy following. I mean, it was just like blood, where you're walking at a really good pace. I will get to when I found my arrow, which I found my arrow at the very beginning part of the blood trail, which is when I kind of knew what was going to be the end result. About 150 yards in, the blood begins to really start to tighten up. And at about 250 yards in, I'm following very small traces of blood, and he hasn't bedded down yet. So I'm understanding of the situation. I have my bow in my hand with an arrow nocked. I am now hoping for an ability to kind of put the Alabama creep on this buck, find him in a bed, and get another arrow in him. So he had worked his way into a very thin, narrow finger of timber. And this little patch is chocked full of honeysuckle. So honeysuckle is that woody, bushy plant that has really light green leaves and small red berries, if you know what I'm talking about, and it holds its leaves pretty late into the season. So I couldn't see, 10 feet in there. And I am going as slow and as quiet as I can. And as soon as I put about 5 steps into this timber finger, he gets up. I didn't see him, obviously, because he was in the honeysuckle, and he takes off the other side, and I watch him run away. No opportunity for a shot. And he is running like he's got a rocket strapped to his ass. His tail is up, and he is taking those big bounding leaps as he's running away. And so I was pretty deflated, right? If you guys have ever tracked or bumped a really wounded deer, like a punch, like a gut shot or a liver shot deer, you know they kind of saunter away. They don't really just take off running. They don't do those big bounds. They get out of there. And this deer did not react that way. So backing up to my arrow, when I'd first found the arrow, I had gotten from the tip of the broadhead to good blood, like a solid red ring of blood on the arrow, was just a touch over 4 inches. And so, as anybody knows, like that shoulder on a deer, when you've cleaned one, it's at least that. And before you get into the body cavity, then you have the rib cage, which is another probably 1.5 inches. And in my belief, I think you need about 7 inches of penetration on a deer in the shoulder to get into that body cavity to tap into those lungs. So my only hope was that I had hit some type of blood vessel or artery or something that would allow him to bleed via hemorrhage and not through, popping a lung or hitting the heart, just because I knew I was too high to hit the heart, and I was, in that lung area behind the shoulder, but it didn't get through the stuff that I needed it to. So that next day I went out and walked that draw again. Never found him. I watched for ravens. I watched for vultures. Never found any sign to make me really think, okay, you need to go walk this even more. And to back up a tiny bit, like the bed that he was in, there was only maybe a spot about 3 inches in diameter in that bed that he had finally decided to lay in. So that next week was gun season. So literally the Friday a week from when I shot the Ziegler was opening day of firearm season in Illinois. And so I had checked all my cameras. I really was hoping for redemption on this deer. I wanted to know exactly where I'd hit him because I did not have the film, which is such a luxury, For people that have done it, how nice it is to have that footage just to confirm exactly where you think you shot the deer. And if you've never done it, it's something that allows you, like I said, it's the biggest asset to filming. Only a touch in front of being able to relive those memories, but especially when you're bow hunting, just to be able to know exactly where that arrow went in the deer. I didn't have that because I'd smack the camera when my bow jumped. So it's gun season. And I've been running cameras, and actually the day of firearm season, the Ziegler showed back up on camera. So that was a big relief. I didn't think it was a fatal shot. You never know what could happen, but he has been back in a couple times now. Very sporadic. He's got the full education, right? I called him in. He heard me. He saw me, and then I shot him. So that deer is as educated now as any deer could ever be. And hopefully he doesn't have too good of a memory. And so next year or later this year, we'll see if I can catch up to him or not. But now on to gun season. So I did not put any blinds out on this property this year just because of time constraint and really equipment constraints to be able to move the blinds from, the bread and butter farm over to the heartbeat farm. And so no blinds. It was really kind of cold, if you remember back then. And so Friday morning, I only had a chance to hunt for a little bit before I had to do some work. I sat on the ground, actually overlooking the trench, sat high on the opposite side knob, and I did not see a single deer that morning. That evening, I wasn't able to hunt on Friday. Actually, I take that back. I did go out for about 1 hour, really quick, Hail Mary, and again, I wasn't able to see a deer. Then that Saturday, I went out very slow again, and I remember thinking to myself, okay, I need to put myself in a position just where I can utilize the power of my muzzleloader. I shoot a CVA Paramount. It's a 45 caliber muzzleloader, and I have a VX5 HD Leupold scope on top of it. I'm shooting, that gun is about a 3/4 minute at 100 yards, and this year I stretched it out as far as I ever have, actually to 360 yards on a 6-inch gong, and 3 out of 3 shots. Now this is me laying prone, so it's about as stable as anybody could ever want. I clapped that dinger at 360 yards with this muzzleloader. So my Leupold scope, that dial was on, and the gun can shoot better than I can probably. So that Sunday morning, I remember I woke up, and it was cold. It was the coldest morning of the firearm season in Illinois. I think it was like a real feel in the mid to low single digits. And I'm like, I'm just going to bundle up, and I'm going to see how long I can last. So I put on my Calor base layers from Badlands as my next to skin. I then wore my Calor pants underneath my Pyre bibs, and up top I wore my Flex hoodie, I wore the HU2 vest, and then I wore the Pyre jacket. Now, the one secret thing that I wore is an underwarmer. If you remember last year, we worked with those guys, and it's one of those products that you don't believe in until you try them. We have a code with them still. Last Breath at the checkout will get you $2 off the product. So for about $10, these things really can be a lifesaver. I had that on. I put my Calor next to skin base layer on. Then I put my underwarmer, my Flex, my vest, and my Pyre suit when I dressed in the field, obviously. But when I got out there, it was dark. It's pitch black. I carried in a chair. I'm like, I need to go to the point on the farm where I can see the furthest. And the only thing that really was going to get cold on me that I was worried about was my feet. So I'm sitting there, and I was incredibly impressed with how comfortable I was. After sitting there for about 45 minutes and the first light's starting to happen, I'm like, I might be able to make it through most of the morning, you know? I have my gun in my bog, and then I carried in, like I said, a chair, and I'm sitting there, and I'm just thinking about the Ziegler and thinking about, man, Chachi has been missing in action for a long time, and I'm like, I don't even know if Hershey's is around. So 300 yards exactly across the field is a gate hole that the farmer, or I should say the landowner, opened up to a large kind of like set-aside area. And the last couple of years, I put a mock scrape there, and it's been dynamite. And we had all of our hit listers were on that scrape, on that white oak branch, working it and beating it up. And so the first deer of the morning, it's right about maybe 5 minutes after official sunrise, is just after 7. Here is Hershey's. I watch him walk out of the gate hole and put my binoculars up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that I'm actually seeing him. It was the first time that I've seen this deer on the hoof. Grant was able to see him really close when he was tracking the Rut 9. He was on the other side of the draw, and Hershey's, when he was several years younger, actually came within 4 or 5 yards of Grant face-to-face on the ground when we were tracking that buck. But now I'm staring at this freaking brute, and he is exactly perfectly facing me. And so I set my dial to 300. I had already told myself, like, I'm going to take that shot if it gives it to me and I feel comfortable. I actually was playing around. I have the Moultrie Edge hanging on that fence post that he walked right by. And in the first couple hours of light, I was practicing, like, steadying my crosshairs on there just to see if I could do it without buck fever, to make that off. I'm like, okay, if I can keep the crosshairs on the Edge camera, which is about a 4x6 inch brick, I'm pretty solid. And so I had. So set the dial to 300, and I'm like, your move, man. I am locked in. I'm sitting in the weeds. He doesn't know I'm there. My wind is perfect. And he just kind of walks straight for me. And when I say walk, like he wasn't on a mission. He wasn't scared. He never stopped to take a bite out of the field. He never really stopped to like lift his head up and look left or right. And most importantly, this dude never gave me a shoulder. I mean, it was almost like I had a magnet on my chair. When he came out, his head was not held high like an alert, not down low, but just regular walking at a normal walking pace. This buck came out of that gate hole and walked, I mean, I'm not kidding you, straight line as I could ever imagine to me. And my conclusion to that is that my guess is he was going to go bed literally on the point where I was. There's a small flat that I was sitting on that's maybe a 20-yard circle. And it would be a pretty good spot for a deer to sit there in bed, especially with the wind that we had, so he could have, wind to his back and he could scan the entire field, similar to what I was doing, just have his body turned a little bit. And so he's walking into me. And so like, I'm like lifting my head up from the scope and range. I'm like 250. I'm like, okay, I'm starting to feel really comfortable. And then he gets to 200. I'm like, all right, like, it's still a good shot, but with this gun and this setup, I'm like, I am really starting to feel good. And he gets to like 150 and I'm like, gosh, now we're talking. And I remember telling myself like, Garrett, do not get overconfident. This happened last time. Like you thought he was going to play perfectly, and the deer did, but you didn't finish. So I'm like trying to stay reserved, stay realistic. And he's, again, just walking normal. It probably took him 3 minutes, I would say, maybe a little bit longer to cover the distance. Now he gets to 100. So my gun is sighted in at 100. The dial's back to 0. And I'm like, wow. I'm like, this is too good to be true. I sat here expecting to take a very good poke of a shot. And now he's well within my comfortable range. And I'm going, you just turn left, turn right, and we're going to be okay. Because typically at this spot, there's about 5 different points where these deer cross from the different fingers across the field. And I was thinking, okay, he's either going to come out there and he's going to cut to my left down to one of the 2 grassy fingers, or he's going to cut to my right, which is where I really thought he was going to go based on camera data history, down a waterway. And the thing with that is that it's a pretty good waterway. And I'm like, man, if he starts turning there, I need to kill him because, once he gets in there a little ways, he's going to start going down, not just across from me. So I'm going to lose him. And he kept coming. And now I'm like, all right, he's going to turn left. That's his only option. He's not going to cut up and over the hill and down to my right. And he's getting closer and he's getting closer. He's getting so close now that I'm actually zooming the magnification out on my scope. And I'm starting to get nervous because he's getting like too close, because I'm like, I have a muzzleloader and I'm like, he's got about 80 yards before he runs over to my right and I can't shoot him. And he's only about 50 yards from getting into the timber to my left. I'm like, if he sees me or if the wind swirls, and he decides to take off, I'm kind of in a bad spot. So I'm really processing all this a million miles an hour. He's just on a steady walk. And finally, he just stops. He just looks, kind of like lifts his head up, and he, with his good eye facing me, he looks just kind of, he's dead center facing me, like 100% straight on, lifts his head up a little bit and just tips it slightly to his left. And I'm like, all right, this is a great shot. I have the thoracic opening, and exhale and squeeze the trigger. Thump. That buck rears up like a stallion. Like he comes on his 2 legs and he plants, and as soon as he plants, I just see blood explode out of the front of him. And he's charging, like full on sprinting right at me. And my shot was only at 47 yards. So he was less than 50 yards away. This happens, and he's running dead at me. I've never had this happen. You've seen videos before on YouTube where like a guy will shoot a deer and he runs straight at him. That is exactly what happened with Hershey's. Rears up, comes down, and I just see blood throwing out of the front of his chest. Turns out that I literally cored the center of his heart out. And so he is deadhead running at me, and I am like what am I going to do? Like, I literally thought I need to bail out of this chair. He's going to run quite literally over me. And I flinched a little bit when he was maybe 15 feet away, and he cut just to the left of me. I would say about 8 feet. It's all the further he ran by me. He ran straight into a bent over mulberry tree, and he died. I mean, he died about, I would say, 30 feet maybe away from me, directly underneath the deer stand that we've always hunted out of. Well, we hang it every year, but to decoy from. This is the decoy point. And I was like taken back, on top of the fact that it's Hershey's, that he just full throttle ran straight at me. And I'm not kidding you. He would have ran. I would have probably been able to touch him if I wouldn't have flinched. And it was insane. So I walked over there and checked him out. And if you guys haven't seen him, he is a mainframe 7-point. He's always had this very unusual frame. In the past, he was quite a bit wider and quite a bit longer on his main beams. And his 8-point side was quite a bit larger. So this deer probably has a 6-inch 2 on his 8-point side and maybe about a 2-inch 3. But the unique thing about this deer is that this year he threw these like dagger points, almost like devil horns, right out the front of his bases. They're bladed and they're pretty good sized. I didn't measure them. I would say about 3.5 inches, but they come directly out of his bases and go straight forward. And then his weak side, if you will, is just a great big 6 and has a big heavy main beam and a big heavy G2 and then a brow point. But the deer is just really cool. He's been blind in one eye since we ever started getting pictures of him. And it's a glossy, glassy blue eye that's actually bulging slightly. And it's kind of been his signature. I mean, his rack was one thing, but it was this dead, nasty eye that he's always had. So I don't know exactly how old this buck is. I have an idea. I do believe that he's overly mature, and I'm really excited. I got the teeth kit from Whitetail Labs, deerage.com. You take out the 2 bottom incisors of their teeth on the bottom jaw, the 2 front incisors. You send it in, and then you can pick, how expedited you'd like the service. The quicker you want it back, the more you pay. So I chose the most economical route. I'm going to wait the 3 months to get my results back, but I'm really excited just because, again, I mean, as I evolve personally as a whitetail hunter, I'm trying to get better and better at accurately aging the deer that I hunt, because you can just throw out a number and maybe it sticks, maybe people believe you, but this is just more for my own personal gratification. Be like, hey, I wasn't able to watch this deer kind of grow up from a younger age. When we got him, he was pretty good sized, in the body and in the rack, technically speaking. And so, like I said, I have an idea of how old I think this buck is, and it'll be really interesting for me just to be like, okay, you're within a year or two, or man, you're way off. So, Wayne's got the deer. I had to kind of barter with my wife and beg and plead, and she's like, you're really going to mount this buck? And I'm like, absolutely. Like, this deer is, I'll never kill a deer like this before. A, with a blind, or again, A, with a blind eye, and B, with the unique rack. I mean, everybody kills like a good 8, and everybody kills like a good 10 point sometime along their hunting career. But when you start getting outside of those realms, it's really kind of starts to taper off, like a big 6 or a big fork or something like that. Like, those kind of deer really just trip my trigger. And I don't know why. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if like Hershey's was out there and some 200-inch deer was out there, I'm going to be honest with you, I'd shoot the 200-inch deer. But like, Hershey's is just really cool. And like I said, he's been king of this farm for several years now. It'll be interesting to see how much different our bucks react now that he's gone. I'm assuming he was very aggressive just because of his age and because of some of the videos that we have with him. But I also don't think it's not a coincidence that Chachi was gone for a very long duration of the season. And that was kind of when Hershey started to take over. And with Hershey's being gone, it's about 8 to 10 days again, similar to the TJ and Megatron story that we had last year. Chachi all of a sudden came back on the farm. And so he's been the deer that I've been targeting for the rest of the season. And kind of got a narrow window to get it done. It's picked beans on this farm. There's not much food here, both, from waste and from just natural forage, as there's not a lot of that woody browse on this property. So I kind of know that as the winter sets in, the deer that use this farm change and they go to their winter course, and that's unfortunately an area that I cannot hunt. So I'm working on trying to get Chachi, but I don't think it's a coincidence that once Hershey was removed, that within relatively a short amount of time, Chachi became more frequenting on this farm and almost a regular on the farm now. So in the end, this buck is like I said, he's awesome. I'm proud as punch to kill him. I'm really lucky that I had an opportunity to shoot him. And it's a cool way to end the chapter on this buck. I really don't know which direction he would have went next year. I think given his regression from last year, he kind of had that shrunken, heavier look compared to last year. I'm thinking it would have kind of went in that same direction. And it also kind of goes to show you that sometimes, you see like a goofy racked buck and you're like, oh man, maybe he'll turn into this really crazy freak. And they can, for sure. But in this case, Hershey's just didn't have it in him. Now, switching gears a little bit, as we continue on this podcast, I'm going to reach out to you guys right now, and I want you to send me direct messages to Last Breath or to my personal page. What do you guys want to hear more of? We haven't done a controversy in a little while. Do you prefer those where I get a guest on and we talk about topics that maybe we agree with or maybe we butt heads with? Do you want more informational stuff? Do you want me to kind of go over some of the tactics that I'm doing and using, or have other guests on the show to kind of pick their brains about what they're doing? Or do you want just more of the random bullshit sessions where I grab somebody or sit here by myself, and I don't drink very much, so I'm a lightweight when it comes to that, but crack a couple beers and just talk hunting. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. This podcast is designed to entertain you, the listener. And so any feedback that you give me, I'm going to take to heart, and I'm going to try to incorporate it into these new podcasts as we launch them and make sure that we're producing something that you guys enjoy listening to. But in closing, my voice is starting to give out on me again. I don't know what the heck's going on here. Thank goodness I'm not a singer. But I just want to say thank you for everybody who's been listening and supporting. We got some cool stuff in the books in the future. And if you're still hunting, there's a lot of time. I know some guys are grinding it out there. Some people have had just a dog of a year and had close encounters and opportunities and just haven't quite sealed the deal. There's still time. Some of the best deer that I've ever seen get killed have been in late season, so don't give up. It's not over. And until then, don't waste it.